You thought it was over. You thought that I was going to be done talking about Final Fantasy VII Remake until the game came out. Yeah, you thought I wasn't going to be able to talk about it any more than what's already been talked about. No, no. No, I came up with something and my brain just all of a sudden was like, yep, this needs to be talked about. Because this is stuff, the majority of the questions that I actually have, to some extent, record probably won't get answered until the following releases come to be, which won't be until, at the current rate right now, I mean, we don't know how the development is going to be like and stuff like that. But, those questions aside, there are stuff that will happen later on and everything like that. But there are some actual legitimate questions that we would actually like to know. This is actually some stuff that would actually more or less either comfort gamers or concern gamers. You know what I mean? These are questions that, by no stretch of the imagination, should be taken with a grain of salt. These are questions that obviously we want answers to, but we're not going to see them. So here are 5 questions that we will never know the answers to until E3 of 2020. At least E3 of 2020, because by that point, they'll at least do a teaser trailer revealing the next part of Final Fantasy VII Remake. So keep in mind, this is the first part. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start. So if you're not familiar with how Final Fantasy VII progression has been going up to this point, basically the first part is being released in March 3rd of next year. And what that first part is going to consist mostly of is the Midgar section. In other words, from where you start doing the bomber mission early on in the game, all the way till the Cloud and crew gets to the end of the highway before they decide that they're going to leave Midgar in order to hunt down Sephiroth. That's the majority of the first part. Now, we've discussed this already before of how they've actually are planning on adding stuff into the game to help expand it a little bit better and stuff like that. And it's mostly going to contract mostly involving with Midgar. Now, with that being said, that's just the first part. We don't know how part 2, part 3, so on and so forth are going to be like. And this is a question that definitely would be likable to know, because depending on how the next part's going to be, depends on how fast we're more than likely going to see these other parts. Keep in mind, they still don't know what they're going to do after part 1. They know what part 1's going to consist of, they know what it's going to be like and everything like that, but they don't know how the rest of the series for Final Fantasy VII is going to end up. We have no idea on that nature. So, obviously this question, what will the next part and the others be like? So, the reason why I'm wording this as others is because obviously this is going to probably, depending on the pacing, depends on how many parts it's going to be. So, let's first talk about part 2. What could happen in part 2? And then, depending on part 2's situation, could depend on how far the series may actually end up being made, like how many parts there will actually be. So, with that said, so technically after Midgar, obviously Cloud and crew goes over to the next town over, and Cloud basically talks about the past of what happened before Sephiroth cracked. Is a short term of the evaluation. If you played Final Fantasy VII, you know there's more than just crack. It's more of him losing his absolute mind and thinking that the Genova herself is his mother, thinking that, and he went go bonkers. So there's a bigger story that goes on behind it, but we're going to concentrate of the progression itself. And then after that, you journey forward to the Chocobo farm. You can get a Chocobo, which will help you cross against the swamp where there's like a giant snake monster that can easily kill you in seconds. You go into the cave, you meet up with the Turks, you get out of the cave, and depending on where you want to go depends on how quickly you can actually get down. Now, technically, there is actually a battlefield that happens. Technically, you don't necessarily beat that part until, like, later on, like in Disc 2 or so on and so forth. But you can actually take part in the battle itself. It's completely optional, of course. Now, the next thing to take into consideration as well is the fact that technically the main point of interest is the next town over, where Shinra is holding like a parade or a celebration for President Rufus. Basically, that's the end point. Now, I'm going to say this right now. I'm going to imagine that's basically how far Disc 2, or Part 2, my bad, not Disc 2, Part 2 is going to consist of. Now, that's just an ideal. Now, personally for me, now this is just me saying this, there's not a lot of main story element that goes on in that section. Keep in mind, you're only in the first continent of the world itself. Everything else doesn't happen until you get on the boat to end up in the next coast over, and basically that's where a whole bunch of other stuff actually happens, you know. There's still a whole big chunk of Disc 1 that you still have to go through technically in the original version. But keep in mind, this is the remake version of Final Fantasy VII, so there's going to be a lot more added on to it, obviously. But in terms of the main game aspects, if we had to average out how long it would actually take to get from the end, from the beginning part of where the overworld is, in terms of the story element, all the way to the opposite end of that particular continent, it'd probably take you at least maybe 4 hours, you know, depending, you know, again, depending on the situation. You know, if you're just nonchalantly coasting through it and everything like that, you know, maybe 5 hours at most. But in terms of story, it won't take you but maybe 4 hours to get through that particular chunk of the game. So it's not quite as long as the Midgar section. Remember, in the Midgar section we said that at most it may take you like 8-9 hours at best, but it's not a big, well, actually it is a big chunk, but it's not the big chunk of Disc 1. You know, you still have the overworld and everything of that nature. Depending on how they do the next part, which, again, I'm assuming that they're going to stop right at the other opposite side of the entire continent, where they'll meet up with the Shinra the Shinra parade and stuff like that, may very well depend. Now, of course, obviously, that also means that depending on how Part 2 does, that means Part 3 is mostly going to consist with the next continent over, where you'll get to encounter that of the Golden Saucer. Depends on how they're doing the Golden Saucer, could depend on how big the next part's going to be. You also have the fact that that's where you also get an extended story for Red 13. You also have a chance of attaining Yuffie as well as Vincent Valentine. And then, of course, after that, you get to acquire Cid. And that's a big chunk, you know, a lot bigger than what Part 2 might end up being. But keep in mind, too, the development team is one to add in more stuff to make the game feel a lot more bigger, as well as to add in a lot more quests. And keep in mind, this is actually part of an open world concept for Final Fantasy VII, which means this gives them more opportunity to add in extra stuff. But that's just what could happen. We don't know how they're going to go about it, which actually involves the second question: how will you be traveling? Basically, you know, how is traveling going to be like whenever you get to the overworld setup of Final Fantasy VII? So, in the original Final Fantasy VII, the overworld is basically this giant map. You're on this giant map, and you walk from town to town and stuff like that, and it transitions into the main town itself. So, depending on how they're going to do these next parts, could very well differ how they're going to go from here on out. So, first theory is that it's going to be still open world. Like, obviously, you will still be traveling along through this big, massive map. You'll be going through this open field, sort of like that of, what's the best way to look at it? Probably like Final Fantasy XV or something like that, where you're actually exploring the open world and everything like that, and you get to enter in these different towns and stuff like that as you continue playing through the game and everything like that. but depending on how they go about in terms of programming the game, followed by the layout of it all, could very well depend on how big of a part it's going to be. Like I said, there's really like 6 or 7 areas in the first continent that you're actually exploring, you know, so, and there's not really a lot of stuff that's going on in that first part, so naturally, depending on how they do, may very well depend on how big of a section could be. Now, there's another alternative that they can make entirely, and that's just build up a fast travel mechanic. Now, what I mean by fast travel, I mean like, obviously, you go from Midgar to the next town over, and then when you get done with that section, you scroll over to the Chocobo farm. Then once you attain a Chocobo, which obviously they'll probably do like a small little side quest where you have to protect the Chocobo or whatever, or try to capture one or so on and so forth, then they'll have like a little segment where you can fast travel to the caverns and stuff like that. Once you get done through there, so on and so forth. Depending on how they do the traveling part may very well depend on how far we'll get to in terms of the next several parts. In other words, depending on if they do the so-called quick select of towns that you visit, followed by, you know, whatever else they may do, we may actually see a transition from the first continent to the second continent, which may also mean that we may actually do the majority of Disc 1 on Part 2, probably, maybe. Now, if they do the open world concept, then my original theory of how it's going to consist mostly of the first continent may very well be true. Again, we don't know how Square Enix is going to do. We've mostly been inside of Midgar, and again, depending on how they handle the Midgar situation, may very well depend on like how much of the game is going to be. And again, depending on how things are going to progress in terms of Part 2, we can suspect of how the other parts are going to be. Whether we're going to see like Part 3, 4, 5, like one part every year, or depending on development, maybe 2 parts per year. I sincerely doubt that that would be the case. I imagine 1 part per year. I imagine that's what they're probably going to more than likely do, if nothing else. Now, I'm being open-minded on this one, you know, there's no reason to get overly exaggerated about it or anything like that. But again, depending on how Part 2 development is going to be, depends on how we can see the progression of the individual parts. Now the next question is an easy one because I've already explained how the development may go from Disc 2, or I keep doing Disc 2, but Part 2 of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that is, when will we get the other party members? You know, like I said, the previous mentioned Cassis, Vincent Valentine, Yuffie, Sid, all of those are attained in the second continent, you know, after you get done with the first part of it. So in other words, you don't get them until like near the second half of the game, you know. So that being said, there's still a whole bunch of stuff that's got to be done. So depending on how they do Part 2, may very well depend on how fast we may get the other party members. Maybe they might change it up to where you can actually get Yuffie in the second continent. I'm not sure if that's the case, but that might be something they may be considering, you know, considering there's still quite a chunk way before you can get access to like Yuffie, Vincent, and all that other stuff. And again, depending on how they do in terms of traveling the overworld and everything like that, may very well differ of how you will get the party members. So, if I had to take a wild guess, I think maybe we won't see these other party members until Part 3. In other words, Part 1 with more of the introduction to Final Fantasy VII, where you've got Cloud, Aerith, Barret, Tifa, as well as obviously Red 13, which means in Part 2, we're going to see these guys a lot in Part 2, but then in Part 3, that's whenever everyone gets added on into it. In other words, Part 1 and 2 is mostly going to consist of the first half of party member characters, and then this third part is going to consist of the second half that finally gets added on into it. Now, again, this could change. This could make the Part 2 change up a little bit, which means that maybe they might be in Part 2. I sincerely doubt it. So, I'm going to say we won't see them until Part 3. This fourth question, I think a lot of people are going to think that I'm overthinking this. Like, I'm really overthinking it. There's no way they're going to change this. This is a big game changer if it does. But I think Square might be they're not really hinting anything at it. They're not. But I think Square is considering this option. Keep in mind, they basically stated that in the first part, there's going to be a number of dialogue choices that go through the game. Some of these dialogue choices can actually change over time. There are some events that happen depending on the choices of the dialogues. You know, again, like I said, in the Golden Saucer, there's that date that happens. There's some other choices that happen along the way. But depending on how Square wants to do the story may very well differ how this question is going to get answered. And that is Aerith going to die? Now, I think a lot of people are going to literally lose their shit if I even mention this, you know, if I even remotely mention this. But you know what? The game's been out for 25 years. If you don't know now, you've been living under a rock, okay? You've been living under a big flippin' rock and have no internet for ages. So if you didn't know, Aerith technically dies by the end of Disc 1. And I imagine it's going to happen. However though, there is a lot that you would have to do in order to get Aerith's final limit break. There is a lot that you would have to do. You would have to push in order to make certain that Aerith even remotely gets the ability to use the final limit break. So you don't really get to have a chance to use Aerith to her full extent, you know. So by the time you get done with part 1, Aerith is completely gone. You know, there's no way to revive her. You know, technically in the early days, there were people theorizing that there is a way to have an Aerith character in your party, but those since then have been completely busted. You know, those theories are completely out the door. They don't exist. They don't actually do anything. However, though, Square Enix may be considering, I sincerely doubt it, but they might be considering changing this part, you know. Depending on your dialogue choices may very well depend on if Aerith dies or if she lives, you know. But then again, if that's the case, that means that the overall game will change entirely. There will be a different ending entirely based on if Aerith survives or dies, you know. Because technically, when Aerith dies, that basically progresses the story in terms of like what happens to the holy magic, what goes on towards the end of the game, so on and so forth. But if Aerith stays alive, that could change everything entirely. Now this doesn't mean really anything, and really this has not been confirmed at all. But this is an interesting concept that I thought to my head, and I was like, this could happen. I sincerely doubt it. But what if Square is actually considering this ideal of like, what would happen if we kept Aerith alive? And I'm sure they're really, really thinking about it. They're really, really working hard into thinking, what would happen if Aerith stayed alive, you know? Would the story still stay the same, or will it change everything entirely? Because keep in mind, there was also another news-related topic stating that everything that happened in the Final Fantasy VII universe, whether it's Advent Children, Dread of the Servers, Crisis Core, they do not connect with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which means there may be subtle changes that could happen, including Aerith's death, which means there could be an option where Aerith has a chance of survival versus where she dies. So, yeah, that this could change the entire progression of the game, and this could very well be something that they are considering. They may not do it entirely, maybe Aerith will still die, but Square might be wanting to consider, okay, let's think about this first. What would happen if Aerith actually lived? You know, like they might be thinking about it, they may not actually do it, but they're definitely thinking about it. They're probably thinking about it, I bet. And finally, the final question that I have to ask, because technically in the original game this doesn't actually happen, but technically there is another game that actually coexists for it, and that is Zack going to be is Zack going to be playable when we get to that point? Okay, so technically this happens in Disc 3, but Cloud enters in this memory segment of where you actually get a little story exposition where Cloud and Zack used to be friends, and Zack is trying to save Cloud because he's been Mako infused, so he's kind of like in this comatose stage of not being able to move, so Zack is just trying to protect Cloud and save him. Unfortunately though, Shinra soldiers are after both of them, and Zack dies, unfortunately. But this kind of makes me wonder, will Zack be playable in this like little memory segment? Keep in mind, they say they're going to change a lot of stuff that goes on in the main game. One of them, I'm willing to say, is the fact that once you go through this memory transition, there will be a segment in which where you play as Zack. That is a possibility. That's not to say that it's going to happen, but that is a possibility, you know. Because keep in mind, in that section of the story, it more or less explains from where they live, from where they leave the Shinra Manor, all the way up to, like, before Midgar, where Zack ultimately dies and gets killed by a mass army of soldiers. So, in other words, yeah, this would be interesting, but I wonder if they're going to incorporate a huge story section dedicated to Zack. It would be interesting if that's the case, which would mean that that would confirm that Crisis Core is not connected to the remake at all, and instead it has its own story element where you technically play as Zack. Now, how big this section is going to be, I doubt it's going to be any bigger than what a normal, like, 3-5 hour game time period would actually take part. You know, it depends on how far they go. It also depends on if they're even going to remotely include Genesis. I sincerely doubt it, but if they do include Genesis and Angel into the mix, then we may actually get a further exposition of Sephiroth's beginning origins, as well as like Crisis Core being packed into the Final Fantasy VII Remake. If not, then we can assume that it's just going to be that one section, in which case it may take up to 2 hours or 3 hours, depending on if it is remotely playable. I guess it's a matter of, like, we have to wait until then, which probably won't be, probably depending on how the second part's going to be, probably 5 or 10 parts from now. So, I doubt it's going to be 10 parts, but if it ends up being 10 parts, I'm going to lose my absolute mind. But wouldn't it be ironic if they try to keep it in that little ironic stage of where they try to make it into 7 parts? It's stupid, I know, but I get the funny feeling that Square Enix is trying to add in a little humor into it, and because keep in mind, there are like little subtle hints for Final Fantasy VII where there's like a 7 indentation of some kind, sort of like how with 13 it's like 13 days, for Final Fantasy VIII it was like 8 days and something like that. And technically in 7, there was like some kind of 7, I don't remember what it was specifically, but there was in fact 7 somewhere in the game. So it'd be funny if it actually took 7 parts to do the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It would be funny if it ended up being the case, but we don't know yet right now, you know. So anyway though, that's all of the individual questions that I have in regards to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which none of them will get answers to until literally E3 2020. Maybe at most we might get like a little teaser trailer when we beat Final Fantasy VII Part 1 Remake, and they'll show a little tidbit of what's going to happen in Part 2, perhaps. Again, we don't know anything, we just know what is going to be confirmed for Part 1, so it's going to be interesting to see how it goes from here. But anyway though guys, thank you so much. Leave your comments, let me know what you think could happen in the next further parts. I'd kind of be interested to see what could happen, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys.